Welcome. Today we're beginning a very thorough exploration into the facts surrounding the case of Amber Tuccaro.
It's a subject that really demands immense gravity and respect.
It does. We're looking at a story that details not only the awful tragedy of a young woman's disappearance and death, but also one that exposes these profound, documented systemic failures within law enforcement in Canada in the early 2010s.
It's absolutely essential that we approach this material carefully. The sources we have, the official reports, the timeline of the investigation, the civilian review, they all serve as a really critical case study.
So our aim here is for clarity.
Exactly.
We want to trace Amber Tuccaro's last known moments, really understand the immediate response by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP, and then we need to dissect the findings of that independent review. The one that concluded the investigation was fundamentally deficient.
That's right. Because the documents we've examined, they provide these very concrete factual details that move this whole conversation beyond just general allegations. This case is, it's frequently cited as a crucial example. It's part of that broader national discussion around the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, or MMIWG.
So our mission today is really to give you a clear, structured understanding of the specific procedural breakdowns, the ones that ultimately compromise the pursuit of justice for Amber and for her family. We're really looking at the mechanism of institutional failure itself.
And those findings, they point to institutional issues that are not. They're not just simple errors of judgment. They're systemic deficiencies in training and in adherence to established policy. For any learner trying to understand this tragic history, grasping those structural failures is just paramount.
So we'll be looking at how policies designed to ensure a thorough investigation they were repeatedly ignored, and in some really critical ways.
That's the core of it.
Okay, so let's unpack Amber Tuccaro's life and her identity first. Let's establish the scene before we move into the devastating timeline of her disappearance.
Good.
Amber was born on January 3rd, 1990. She was a member of the Nisku Cree First Nation. And at the time of her disappearance in 2010, she was just 20 years old. She was living in Fort McMurray, Alberta.
And that detail is just so foundational. 20 years old.
Mm-hmm.
But she was already so deeply connected to her community, to her family.
And crucially, she was a mother.
Yes. She was a mother to a 14-month-old son. When we discuss a missing person, understanding their roots, their responsibilities, it's essential because it immediately pushes back against any lazy assumption that a person might have just walked away from their life.
Of course.
Amber had an infant child, a family waiting for her.
And her presence in the Edmonton area that August in 2010 was for a very simple planned activity. On August 17th, she flew from Fort McMurray to Edmonton for what the sources describe as a short trip. A vacation.
And she wasn't traveling by herself.
No, she wasn't. She had her infant son with her and also a female friend.
And their destination was specific. They booked a hotel in Nisku. Now, for anyone who might not know the area, Nisku is a community just south of Edmonton. It's often associated with the international airport, a lot of regional industrial areas.
Right, it's a transit hub.
It is. It's a place people pass through or stay temporarily. So this establishes a very clear, very specific location for where this timeline begins. Mm-hmm. And that becomes absolutely vital when we start tracking where she ended up.
And this is where the narrative pivots. It goes from a simple family trip to this moment of just alarming uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
The disappearance happened the very next evening, August 18th, 2010. It was around 8 p.m. She was last seen accepting a ride, hitchhiking into Edmonton with an unknown man.
The location of that hitchhiking event, right near a major transport area like Nisku, it does suggest an opportunistic encounter. But the sources confirm that this encounter, it wasn't just random. It became concerning very, very quickly. And that's based on highly unusual and eventually critical evidence later released by police.
And this is where the investigation got a piece of evidence that is so rarely available in missing persons cases.
It's incredible, really.
During that car ride with the unknown man, Amber Tuccaro received a phone call. And that conversation, or at least parts of it, it was recorded. And you can clearly hear the voice of the unknown male driver in the background.
The value of that recording, it just cannot be overstated. It is a live action piece of evidence. You're capturing the perpetrator's voice, a critical exchange of dialogue. But the dialogue itself is what it just makes the hair stand up on the back of your neck.
Yeah.
It suggests that Amber realized almost immediately that she was being misled. The driver, He assures her they're heading east on a back road, heading toward Edmonton.
But her direct response to him, the quote that really anchors this whole tragedy, is this plea for safety. It suggests her fear was instantaneous. She's recorded saying, "You'd better not be taking me anywhere I don't want to go."
Chilling.
Yeah.
That single line is a moment of pure, documented vulnerability and realization of danger.
It really is.
It captures the precise moment that her perception of the trip shifted from just getting a ride into Edmonton to a potentially forced abduction. And the police, they later concluded, her realization was accurate. The driver, he was contradicting his own statement in the recording. He wasn't actually heading east toward Edmonton.
He was going south, right?
Precisely. Investigators believe the man immediately drove south into the rural expanse of Leduc County, directly contradicting his stated destination. This deceit, documented on the recording, is why the police could later pinpoint the general search area, years later. They connected the audio to where she was eventually found.
It is genuinely remarkable to have the voice of the person involved, the probable perpetrator, captured on audio, along with the victim's expression of fear almost in real time. It's an investigator's dream piece of evidence.
It should have been.
And yet, this critical audio evidence, capturing that identifiable voice, it wasn't used immediately.
And this is where we see the first major investigative lag that would just play the entire case. Police held on to that audio recording for 2 years.
2 years.
They finally released it to the public in 2012, asking for assistance to identify the driver's voice. We have to pause and just analyze the implications of that 2-year delay. When a piece of auditory evidence is that crucial, the value of releasing it immediately, when people in the community might still recognize the inflection, the accent, the phrasing, that value is exponential.
Of course.
Waiting 2 years means you are relying on fading latent memory. You're dramatically reducing the chances of a positive identification.
It suggests a profound misjudgment about the utility of immediate public help versus whatever internal investigative reason they might have had for holding on to it. That choice, to delay the use of their most powerful tool, it pushes us directly into the systemic failures documented in the civilian review that came later. So when Amber disappeared, her family did the right thing. They immediately reported her missing.
Immediately.
But the sources, they reveal this pattern of institutional response that was, from the very start, dismissive and just fraught with procedural errors. The family reported feeling that the RCMP was not taking Amber's disappearance seriously.
And that immediately led to concerns about bias stemming from these negative stereotypes associated with Indigenous women.
That initial response is so significant, isn't it?
It is, because it gets to the central critique leveled against institutional responses in MMIWG cases across the country. And what was the family told? That Amber Tuccaro was probably out partying.
Based on absolutely nothing.
Zero evidence. That statement immediately establishes a prejudice against the victim placed on her identity, rather than an objective assessment of the high-risk facts. A young woman, a new mother, hitchhiking with a stranger who suddenly vanished.
That dismissal, it just undermines trust right away. But it also creates a procedural hurdle. And compounding the family's distress was this official mandatory delay. Police told the family they needed to wait a full 24 hours before they could even initiate a missing persons investigation.
This specific policy, the so-called 24-hour rule, it's been a point of massive contention in law enforcement for years. Historically, it's based on the idea that adults have the right to disappear voluntarily for a short period.
Right.
But in cases involving vulnerable populations, or those with known high-risk factors, like the immediate context of hitchhiking with an unknown individual, that 24-hour delay can be catastrophic.
Well, if we consider the forensic reality, the first 24 to 48 hours are the golden window. That's when witnesses are freshest, when surveillance footage hasn't been overwritten, when cell towers are still providing recent data, when a search area is still manageable.
Absolutely.
To willingly sacrifice the first 24 hours based on an arbitrary rule, it's a profound investigatory decision.
And that procedural roadblock was just the beginning of the problem. The 2018 Civilian Review and Complaints Commission, the CRCC, they later investigated and concluded that the RCMP did not begin investigating Tuccaro's disappearance until a full month, 30 days after she was reported missing.
30 days! In a case where the victim was recorded expressing fear of her captor. To lose a full month is, it's just an unacceptable institutional failing.
It implies that for 4 weeks, no one was following up on leads, contacting the hotel, or speaking to the friend she traveled with.
The trail was already cold by the time the investigation formally started.
And while that investigation was stalled internally, The public face of the RCMP seemed to be actively minimizing the case. On September 4th, 2010, still within that critical month-long delay, an official RCMP press release stated that they did not believe Tuccaro was in any danger.
How does one reconcile that? Releasing a statement saying she's not in danger, when you possess an audio recording of her saying, "You'd better not be taking me anywhere, I don't want to go," it feels like a direct contradiction.
It raises a critical question about internal communication and perhaps, again, institutional bias. Was the statement designed to calm public fear? Or was it a reflection of their prejudgment, the belief that she had voluntarily left and wasn't a high-priority missing person?
Either way.
Either way, the public communication actively contradicted the evidence they held. And it was devastating to the family. It reinforced the idea that the police simply weren't prioritizing Amber's safety. And it signaled low urgency to every potential witness watching the news.
And the administrative errors didn't stop there. There was a critical, documented error regarding her status on the National Missing Persons List.
Yes, she was eventually placed on the list, but then she was quickly and wrongly removed. This was based on unconfirmed and unsubstantiated alleged sightings.
Just rumors.
Basically, yes. The sources confirmed she had to be put back on the list on September 23, 2010.
So she was taken off the active search roster because of rumors. What are the practical, measurable consequences of removing missing person from that database, the CPIC database?
Removing her from that database is not just a clerical error. It's a national cessation of the active search. It signals to all other police jurisdictions, to border control, to every officer who might run her name, that the crisis is resolved.
That she's been found.
That she has been found or located safely. It kills the momentum of a coordinated cross-jurisdictional investigation. It tells the country, stand down. The Commission's report later designated this delisting as an erroneous decision, highlighting the profound bureaucratic mismanagement.
And what's crucial here as we analyze the institutional response is that the CRCC report noted that despite this grave bureaucratic error, which stalled the search, no formal apology was made to the family for that specific error at the time.
It's a cascading failure. You have the initial dismissal, the 24-hour wait, the month-long investigation delay, the public downplaying, and then this administrative mistake of delisting her.
All in the first few weeks.
All of this happened in the first few weeks when finding Amber alive was still the goal. These weren't minor procedural oversights. They were foundational failures that effectively crippled the investigation before it had even truly begun.
Just sets the stage for the next section, where the focus shifts from bureaucratic failures to these critical failures in physical evidence management. So we now move past that agonizing period of neglect and uncertainty. Nearly 2 years after her disappearance, the family's worst fears were confirmed. On September 1st, 2012, Amber Tuccaro's remains were discovered. They were found by horseback riders in a rural location.
And the location confirms that earlier police analysis. It was a field in Leduc County. This placement, miles away from Edmonton, supported the theory from the audio recording that the driver immediately drove south. It confirmed he had lied to Amber about the direction and the destination.
And she was positively identified soon after.
Yes, via dental records.
So once the case transitioned from a missing persons file to an unsolved homicide, the light shines so intensely on the failures of the preceding 2 years. The 2018 review pointed to serious, inexplicable lapses in evidence and witness handling that happened early on.
And we have to start with the timeliness of investigative action. The Commission noted that it took a staggering 4 months for RCMP officers investigating the disappearance to conduct any interviews at all.
4 months.
4 months after the case was officially opened, which itself was already delayed by a month.
That's approaching half a year. I mean, think about the basic principles of effective police work. Interviews with neighbors, potential witnesses in the area, staff at the Nisku hotel. That's step one.
It should be.
A 4-month delay guarantees that any detail that relied on fresh recall descriptions of the vehicle, the driver, interactions, timings would be significantly compromised or forgotten entirely. For a homicide investigation, interviewing key people should happen in the first 48 hours, not the last 4 months of the year.
And that delay in interviews wasn't the only oversight regarding essential witness contacts. The RCMP was heavily criticized for failing to even contact or interview the woman who traveled with Amber from Fort McMurray to Edmonton.
Let's just grasp the weight of that failure for a moment. Amber traveled with 2 people, her infant son and a female friend. That friend was the last person who knew Amber's state of mind, her plans, her mood, her possible contacts, the circumstances around her decision to hitchhike.
She was a key primary
The
witness.
key primary witness.
And this CRCC report confirms this person, who was never a suspect or person of interest, was simply never interviewed by the RCMP. This represents a fundamental breach of reasonable investigative practice. How can you build a solid timeline of the victim's final hours without speaking to the person who was staying in the same hotel room with her?
It suggests either gross incompetence or an institutional unwillingness to pursue basic leads in a case they had already, it seems, deemed low priority.
It's one of those two things.
Yeah.
And the investigative missteps escalate from there into the absolute catastrophe of physical evidence handling, which the CRCC detailed as a demonstrable policy violation.
We're talking about the accidental destruction of Amber Tuccaro's belongings.
We are. A suitcase containing her property was recovered by investigators from her Nisku motel room. It was then, and the word accidentally is used, it was destroyed by those very investigators.
We have to move past the word accidental and discuss the forensic reality of what was permanently lost. A piece of luggage, recovered from the last known location of a homicide victim, is a treasure trove of evidence. Can we just break down what specific, irreplaceable clues were potentially destroyed here?
Absolutely. The destruction of that suitcase represents a severe breach of the chain of custody. That's the legal requirement that evidence be meticulously documented, protected, and accounted for from the moment it's seized until it's presented in court. The loss here is multifaceted.
Okay.
First, you have electronic data. In 2010, Amber would have had a cell phone or some similar device. That suitcase was the last known location of her personal property. Destroying it means they permanently eliminated any chance of recovering location data, call logs, text messages, or digital communications that could have established a definitive timeline or revealed a prearranged meeting.
A huge loss.
Huge. Second, contact trace evidence. Clothing or personal items in that suitcase might have held foreign hairs, fibers, or, critically, contact DNA, the slightest touch from someone else. Even if the person wasn't the perpetrator, trace evidence could have pointed to key associates or led to a timeline verification.
And third,
Paper trails, receipts, plane tickets, notes, diaries. Anything that could have provided a paper record of her movements and mindset leading up to August 18th.
so the destruction of the suitcase wasn't just losing Amber's clothes. It was eliminating multiple parallel avenues of forensic inquiry that could have provided definitive links to an unidentified perpetrator. It's impossible to undo that level of damage.
It is irreparable. And the CRCC review, they didn't mince words on this. It specified that a constable and a corporal with the Leduc RCMP detachment, their names were redacted in the report, failed to properly follow policy or reasonable investigative practices for securing seized property.
So that moves the issue from systemic bias into documented individual failure to follow the rules of their job. And circling back to that audio evidence, the voice of the suspected abductor, we know that Amber Tuccaro's brother, Paul Tuccaro, revealed that police waited a full year before finally releasing that crucial audio recording to the public and media.
The one-year delay for the audio is just one more example of this investigative inertia. By sitting on the most powerful piece of identifying evidence for 12 months, they effectively guaranteed that the public's ability to recall and recognize that unique voice, perhaps a neighbor or a local acquaintance, would be significantly diminished.
Leads that could have been generated immediately they were delayed until the case was already cold.
Exactly.
So when you look at this whole section together, the 4-month delay in interviews, the complete failure to question the primary traveling companion, the destruction of physical evidence, and the delayed release of the core audio, it paints a picture of an investigation that was severely handicapped and compromised by its own internal operational failures.
It raises the inescapable question. If these procedures, the preservation of evidence, the timely interviewing of key witnesses, the adherence to established policy, if they had been followed from day one, would the case be solved today? And while we can't definitively answer that, the sources strongly indicate that the investigation created its own obstructions to justice through these documented deficiencies.
So the family, devastated and frustrated by this overwhelming catalog of errors and negligence, from the initial dismissal to the destruction of property, they knew they needed external accountability.
They did.
So in 2014, 4 years after Amber's disappearance and 2 years after her remains were found, Tuccaro's family filed a formal complaint. They filed it with the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the CRCC.
And this formal complaint was the mechanism that triggered independent oversight. It demanded an outside investigation into the internal police processes. The CRCC conducted a thorough, independent review, and it culminated in a detailed 120-page report released in August 2018.
And the findings were?
The report's findings were damning, and they provided the validation the family had been seeking for years.
Let's focus on the language of the CRCC's conclusion. The report found the investigation was definitively, quote, deficient in that various members were either not properly trained or did not adhere to their training, and that various members did not comply with procedures and guidelines.
That finding is profoundly important. It confirms that the failures were not random acts of miscommunication, but institutional breaches. They are saying officers were either unskilled or, perhaps worse, willfully disregarding established protocols.
It's a huge distinction.
It is. When an independent civilian oversight body states that officers, quote, did not comply with procedures and guidelines, it elevates the issue from a perceived injustice by the family to a documented failure of the organization itself.
And importantly, this official conclusion, it validates the family's initial fears of bias. The procedural breakdowns, the initial dismissal, the 24-hour waiting period, they all concentrated in the earliest, most critical stages of the investigation into an Indigenous woman's disappearance. The CRCC confirmed that those errors were rooted in a failure to adhere to professional standards.
Indeed. The report's findings are the ultimate form of institutional accountability. They map out the precise mechanisms by which the case was mishandled. And this detailed review, it provided evidence that the family's claims of neglect were accurate all along.
With the report now public in 2018, pressure mounted on the RCMP to respond formally. Deputy Commissioner Curtis Zablocki apologized to the family 11 months after the report was released on July 25, 2019.
The delay of nearly a year in issuing that apology, even after the independent review laid out all the failures, is notable in itself.
It is.
The official statement from the RCMP acknowledged mistakes, with Zablocki stating that the RCMP's investigation was not our best work. And while that is an admission of failure, it's still a somewhat softened phrasing compared to the CRCC's finding that the investigation was systemically deficient and riddled with policy breaches.
But the crucial final context here is the family's reaction. The sources confirm that the Tuccaro family formally rejected Deputy Commissioner Zablocki's apology.
And their rejection speaks volumes. It's about the perceived sincerity and the timeliness of the institutional response. We have to analyze the psychology of this rejection. By the time that apology arrived, it was nearly a decade after Amber's disappearance.
Yep.
It came after years of the family fighting institutional dismissal, after the destruction of evidence, and after the investigative trail had gone completely cold.
For the family, the damage done by the initial procedural failures was irreversible. An apology 9 years later, confirming what they already knew, it can't restore the lost evidence, the lost time, or, most importantly, the lost chance at identifying the man responsible for Amber's death.
The rejection fundamentally connects this case back to the demands of the broader MMIWG movement, which stresses that accountability cannot be merely symbolic or rhetorical. Justice for these families requires tangible results, a solved case, and demonstrable change in police culture and procedure. An apology that follows a devastating external review and years of neglect often rings hollow when the perpetrator remains free.
And that heartbreaking reality is the final essential fact of this case. Despite the formal acknowledgement of massive errors, despite the detailed review, and despite the apology, the case of Amber Tuccaro remains officially unsolved as of 2025.
It's categorized as an unsolved homicide.
Yeah.
And that unsolved status is the ultimate tragic consequence of the deficient investigation. The failures in evidence preservation, the failure to interview essential witnesses, and the lack of adherence to basic policy created investigative gaps so large that they have, thus far, proven impossible to bridge. And that ensures that the Tuccaro family is left without the closure of justice.
Reviewing this extensive body of source material regarding Amber Tuccaro's case, we see a tragic and disturbing pattern emerge. You have a young mother who goes missing, and that's followed by an almost immediate institutional failure to treat her disappearance with the urgency and the procedural rigor it demanded.
When we synthesize the systemic issues confirmed by the CRCC, Tuccaro's case stands as a devastating illustration of institutional bias at work. The initial prejudice, that assumption that she was out partying, it led directly to procedural neglect.
The month-long delay.
The month-long investigation delay, the catastrophic destruction of physical evidence, and the failure to interview key people. The report confirms that these weren't isolated incidents of bad luck, but documented breaches of established police standards directly impacting a vulnerable population.
The official findings validate the family's concerns, which were initially dismissed as just frustration or an emotional reaction. The fact that an independent review validated their assertion that the RCMP failed to properly adhere to policy or training, that's a profoundly important moment for accountability, even if it arrived too late to save the investigation itself.
The case serves as a very sober reminder of how deeply entrenched biases, conscious or unconscious, can translate into actionable procedural neglect. And that neglect, in turn, compromised the investigation's integrity from the moment she was reported missing. What's genuinely startling is that the problems weren't necessarily about lacking resources, but about failing to execute the fundamental basic policing standards that already existed on paper.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner, as you process these facts? We have detailed extensive, documented failures in the earliest stages of this investigation, from the initial dismissal of the family's concerns to the destruction of irreplaceable physical evidence.
I would encourage you to consider this provocative thought. How do foundational errors, particularly those that occur in the very first 48 hours of an investigation, when the trail is freshest and urgency is paramount, how do they permanently obstruct justice? In this case, the investigation was sabotaged by those initial procedural violations and the destruction of evidence, ensuring that the pursuit of truth and justice became exponentially harder, perhaps even impossible. The integrity of that first window of time is often the single greatest determinant of a successful resolution.
A truly sobering lesson in institutional responsibility and the pursuit of justice. Thank you for joining us for this crucial exploration of the sources. We hope this analysis has provided clarity and essential insight into the facts surrounding the death of Amber Tuccaro and the subsequent review of the response. We greatly appreciate you taking the time to listen and learn with us. Thanks for listening.